Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Meredith Ward. I'm on the clergy team here, and while our vicar, the Reverend Peter Thompson, is on sabbatical, I am going to do my very best to fill his shoes in hosting and moderating the forum over these next few weeks. This is a place where every Sunday we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. This morning we are delighted to have with us the Reverend Kevin VanHook II, Executive Director of Episcopal Charities, to discuss the ways in which our diocese is caring for migrants and others in need. Kevin, welcome. It's so great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm definitely excited to be here this morning, so thank you so much.
Well, it's a treat to have you with us. To kick off our conversation, I wonder if you could just introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and what are some of the things in your personal background that drew you to this ministry and that helped shape your path to Episcopal Charities?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for that. Was on. Oh, here we are. Can you hear me now? Awesome. Thank you so much. So you ask a big question, and so I could probably talk for days about that, but I know we want to get kind of to the meat of things. But as you mentioned earlier, I'm Kevin VanHook. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of Episcopal Charities. And so just a little bit about myself. I grew up, you can probably tell in my voice a little bit, just a bit of an accent. I grew up in Texas, and so there in Baptist country. And so I grew up, I was a pastor's kid there, and I would say I was called to ministry pretty early in life, but I kind of ran from that. And so for me, my background is pretty diverse. I was a second career clergyman, if you will. And so I attended the Air Force Academy, went to school there, went to flight training, and then ran a space program in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so that was kind of my background before coming into ministry, if you will. And so when I finally kind of decided to answer that call into ministry, I ended up going to seminary in New Jersey. And so from there, I spent a few years serving as the Minister of Justice, Advocacy, and Change at the Riverside Church. And so I ran social justice and outreach ministries there before coming over to Episcopal Charities. And it's been such a joy being at EC for about 2 years now. And so I was one of those folks who kind of had to navigate a transition during the middle of the pandemic. I still remember my first, I would say about 6 months or so, I would go into the office at the diocese, and the staff weren't coming in yet. And so it was those early days, if you will, but definitely grateful for the ministry that we've been able to do over the last few years there at EC. I want to make sure that I've answered your complete question, though. And I think you asked, was it just how I got connected with EC?
Yeah, what was it that drew you to EC, and how was that transition from Riverside to the Episcopal Church?
So it's an interesting draw. For me, one of the things, kind of a word that always comes up for me is impact, if you will. And so it was an interesting or a unique opportunity to really just expand the impact that we were having. So when I was at Riverside, I'm big on catchment areas, if you will, in the sense of being able to really understand the impact that you're making on a community. As a minister, the way I approach my work, I always say that one of the greatest compliments that I can receive is if I were to leave a place, not so much that the folks who are there Sunday after Sunday would notice a difference, but the community, the folks outside of the church would notice that something is different. And so I'm always focusing on catchment areas in the sense of how we really serving a community. And so at Riverside, we were very particular about our catchment areas from 96th Street to 179th on the west side of Manhattan. And so we knew that area pretty well. And when Episcopal Charities came along, it was a unique opportunity to expand that, because as you all know, the Diocese of New York is very diverse. I know for most folks, when they hear the Diocese of New York, they think Manhattan, but we've got Staten Island, Manhattan, the Bronx, Orange County, Sullivan County, Westchester, going all the way up to Ulster. And so it was very a unique opportunity in the sense of connecting with urban, suburban, exurban, rural issues. And so that's really what drew me into the work. And once I really started getting to know some of the parishes throughout the diocese, that just ignited this passion within me. And so I'm real big on this idea of wanting to solve like big problems or address like these major challenges. And so when I came over to Episcopal Charities, it was a very interesting time because they were going through a transition. As you all know, we were in the middle of the pandemic, and so everything shifted. And what was very interesting at that time is that we had a board of directors that was very interested in this ideal of us coming out of the pandemic a different organization than the way we came in, because the needs of communities changed, and so we had to adapt. And so even for our first 2 years, I focused on this idea of transformation. And so we've gone through quite a bit of that at Episcopal Charities and adapted the way we address needs. And so it's been a fun time and a rewarding time, but a time where we've seen a lot of impact in communities as well. So yeah.
Thank you for that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the wider diocese in a little bit. I really want to hear more about that. But so many organizations have had to undergo transformation. Yes. Just naturally in the life of the organization, but the pandemic forced a lot of change. Could you tell us a little more about the specific changes that have happened at EC in that as part of that transformation?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I would say the first 25 years or so of Episcopal Charities, we operated as a pass-through organization where money would come in, and we had a very unique distribution model, which we still have, which is really what kind of sets us apart. But we're embedded in the communities that we serve. For instance, even here at St. Bart's, we're embedded with Crossroads, where you all know on the ground what are some of the needs that folks are experiencing. We go to different places throughout the diocese, and those parishes know those needs. And so even when we're applying to grants with these major foundations, what makes us unique and what's really interesting is that we've got real-time data, and it changes daily as these feeding programs are open. And it's not just feeding programs, there's clothing programs, there's ESL classes, you name them, our youth opportunity grants. And so we had access to data. And so on the ground, we were asking just program leaders, what are the changes you're seeing in light of the pandemic? And so with that, we shifted a bit from just being a simple pass-through, where we started having our own internally ran programs. And what I mean by that, there's 3 that we launched during that period of COVID. And we've scaled them, and they're still in operation now. The first would be our bulk buy program. And so what we've done with bulk buy, when you think about a lot of our food pantries, what we were doing before is we were, this particular pantry gets a $10,000 check. This particular pantry gets $10,000. As opposed to doing that, we were able to aggregate demand, and we were able to buy higher quality food, particularly higher quality proteins, because we were aggregating demand and able to purchase food at a lower price, if you will. This it's in the name, bulk buy. And so what's interesting is that even today, when our staff goes to different programs, if you ever think about most food pantries, you go in, or feeding programs, you go in and you'll see the canned goods, you'll see the green beans, you'll see the spaghetti. What's interesting, even to this day, when our staff goes into places, they'll say, wow, are we getting meat today? Because usually when we see you all, that's when we know we're getting the higher quality proteins. And most pantries don't have meat, but we're able to contract with different farmers and get meat. And so that kind of lifts up our second program, which is our Farm to Pantry program. And what that does is that we were able to connect with a group of farmers throughout the Mid-Hudson. And what's interesting is that a lot of these farmers that we've connected with, they've been a part of marginalized communities, whether they're part of BIPOC or LGBTQ farmers. But what we were able to do, because they were being kind of pushed out of various contracts, at the beginning of the growing season, what we'll do is we'll go to different food pantries. Because, for instance, I'll give a very specific example. There was one of our programs served a population that was a high Guatemalan population, but they were serving spaghetti. And so when folks come into line, they don't even know how to cook that, if you will. And so what we're doing is we're focusing on culturally relevant food. And so at the beginning of the growing season with our Farm to Pantry program, we're able to go to that particular feeding program and say, hey, what are folks coming here wanting to see? What are they wanting to pick up that they might not have access to? And we're able to sign contracts with farmers that were already kind of experiencing, they weren't getting a lot of business. And so it's almost solving multiple problems with one solution, because it keeps the farmer in business, but it's also they're growing a product that's needed in that particular community. And what we've done over the last 2 years is because we want to transition folks off of that eventually and give other pantries an opportunity. But what we've seen is that the pantries have loved that relationship so much that they've gone off on their own and kept that contract or that relationship going. And so that's our Farm to Pantry program. And it's grassroots, something that we just really adapted to based off of need. And then the last one is our Francis Perkins program, which is something that I'm so proud of. During my early days in the diocese, it was the middle of the pandemic. Most folks were still worshiping online. And so I did what I called eavesdropping. Even here at St. Bart's, I eavesdropped a little bit. But it was on a Sunday morning, it was pretty easy to just go in and listen online what was being said in the pulpit at various parishes throughout the diocese. And so two things that were really, everyone was hitting on, whether they were in Manhattan or up in Ulster County, the two major issues at that particular time was homelessness as well as mental health. And so we started scratching our heads in the office in the sense of what can we do about that? Or what role could Episcopal Charities potentially play? And so we developed our Francis Perkins program, which is really an MSW internship, if you will. And we call it a fellowship because I don't know if you all know this, but a lot of MSW students, they are required to get a lot of hours in throughout the academic year, but they're typically not paid. And so we're very proud that we give them a stipend. And so we call it a fellowship as opposed to an internship. But with that being said, what we're able to do is we're really able to place those interns or those fellows in places that typically wouldn't be able to afford them. And what they're doing is they're, one, helping us collect data, but then they're also able to connect different clients to resources throughout the city or the state that really go unnoticed quite a bit. And so that's one thing that we're definitely proud of. And I have to say something about the name. You probably know Francis Perkins was the first woman to serve in a cabinet position. She was a faithful Episcopalian, but she served as the Secretary of Labor under FDR and was really this architect of the New Deal. And so when we're looking for someone, and she was a social worker, I should say that, but so when we were looking for a new name for this social work fellowship, if you will, we had to look no further than Francis Perkins. And so we really want to embody that. And so last year we had 9 social workers spread throughout the diocese in under-resourced areas that typically wouldn't be able to afford them. And just some of the data that we're able to collect, some of the results and the impact that we're able to see in the sense of connecting folks to resources that they had no idea about is something that we're proud about, and we would love to be able to expand that program eventually.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea. I mean, here at St. Bart's, we've seen that need where we have people coming for food, people coming for faith, but there's this sort of gap in between where the social worker fills connecting folks with resources. And I think that's such a brilliant sense to fill that, a way to fill that gap, both in terms of training the social work students and filling the need.
Yes.
You mentioned Crossroads, and
Yes.
we are just delighted that Crossroads is, as all of you know, is a major feeding program of St. Bart's and operates here out of the church building 7 days a week. And it's really important for us to remember that Crossroads is a beneficiary of Episcopal Charities. So what we give today, and I'll invite you to give a little bit later, but there's a mutuality between the work of Episcopal Charities and what we do here on the ground, as Kevin said. a lot of us are pretty familiar with the work of Crossroads. We see lines of folks lined up on 51st Street, waiting to get in, and many of you here are volunteers at Crossroads, so you know the work there intimately well. But I'm wondering how you, if you can tell us a little bit about feeding programs in other parts of the diocese that aren't in the middle of urban centers, and how that works, and how Episcopal Charities works with those.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love you mentioned Crossroads. Even as I was on my way in for the 9 o'clock service, there was already a line forming. Yeah. And so I just know the work that Jesse Ramos and Martha Avery are doing there. Their entire team is just phenomenal. And so I love every opportunity that I get to even come and visit you all and just seeing the work that you all are doing here. But with that being said, I'm proud of the work that is going on all throughout the diocese. One of the ways we approach our work, I always say, kind of a line that I say is that we're a community of outreach programs. And we really want to live into that because, yes, we do, write checks to different programs, but we also want to be so much more than that. We're really a family. For instance, during the pandemic, we had to walk with folks through some very difficult and challenging times, whether it was, hey, we're seeing numbers explode and we don't know what to do or how to deal with it. We need training on this. We need training on that. And really just connecting folks to different resources, or when there weren't any resources available, creating those, if you will, whether it's a training on how to deal with de-escalating conflict or you name it. It's just being creative in the sense of how do we add impact to a program even beyond, writing the check, if you will. And what's interesting is that when we're in those meetings, at one point we were doing them daily, and then we moved to weekly. Now we're on a monthly basis. But when we get program leaders together, they're learning from each other in the sense of, hey, what are you seeing and what are you seeing? And so with that being said, there are a few that automatically come to mind. And when I'm almost shy about emphasizing, one of the other, because we mentioned 62 feeding programs, but altogether, when we look at clothing, when we look at youth opportunity, all of the different types of programs that we have, we're hovering right around 100 programs that we support right now. But a few, especially around feeding in other parts of the diocese that come to mind is even the feeding program at St. Thomas Armenia. And so Armenia, the far reaches of the diocese, what's interesting is that it became known as this place where you could go and get food. It was a place that was serving its community way up in Armenia, so much so that during the pandemic they had to build, I believe they built a playground on top of it, but they also had to start putting park benches up because even folks who weren't a part of the church knew that that's where folks gather and that's where they come and have community. And so EC, we were very proud of the fact we supported them with a very special grant to help build an additional building where they could do food distribution out of, just because demand increased so significantly during that time. Another one that's a little bit closer to here, I'm thinking of Holyrood Food Festival, which is up in Washington Heights. But I remember my first time visiting there, and that's one of the places where they're excited whenever we're bringing higher quality proteins, meat on their distribution days. But really, when you go there, the line, and it's right around near Port Authority, but the line wraps around the building, really around the block. And so it's a mostly volunteer-led team, no professional staff, but they're just doing amazing things and being able to leverage different relationships with the Common Pantry as well, to really just meet the needs of its community. And so those are two that stand out. I also wanted to highlight Mount Kisco. They have a food pantry that's doing phenomenal work. I mean, on their distribution days, you almost go around the entire church because they really take a holistic approach in the sense of any need you might have. And they have an incredible team of volunteers that are there helping them. But it's funny that we just see I call it Jesus work, but we see that happening all throughout the diocese. And it's so funny because when we're on those program leaders call, it's not, this mentality of a zero-sum game, but it's really folks are connecting and helping each other, letting them know about different grant opportunities. How do we potentially collaborate on grant opportunities? And so it's really this network of about 100 programs throughout the diocese that are all parish-based and working together in various ways to make a difference in the communities that they serve.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
One of the things that we are here in the city so acutely aware of is the migrant crisis.
Yes.
And the folks who have been sleeping on the sidewalk, and the influx of thousands and thousands of people from all over the world into our city. I'm wondering how that situation has impacted your work, and what kinds of actions have you taken to address this particular situation?
Yes. So, and I'm glad that you asked that question. So we mentioned the 100 programs that we help support. 62 of them are around food. And so we've almost become these experts, if you will, completely accidentally, but around food justice issues. And so a lot of the solutions that we're working on now relate to food, if you will. But we're seeing their effects in numerous ways. I'll give you an example, is that we know that folks are being bused to other parts of the city, or even north of the city. And so, especially in Poughkeepsie, we're seeing just numbers explode. And I was just on the phone with some folks there. I wish I had the stat in front of me. Do I have it? Oh, actually I do. Their shelter. So they were seeing on average, even at the beginning of the pandemic, around 60 folks in their shelter per night. And so what they're seeing now, especially with folks moving north of the city, is that number's hitting around 175. And so it's overflowing. So much so that at Christ Church in Poughkeepsie, their rector serves on our board, and she mentioned in our last conversation that they have about 5 or 6 families that are living on tents on the lawn of the church. And so it's moving north, if you will. And so folks are really kind of coming to us, figuring out, like, what can we do? How do we change? And one of the things that we're doing is kind of living into those programs that we already have in place. And so we're kind of leaning into food, because the food lines are getting long at most programs. I've only heard of one program that their line hasn't been impacted yet, and that's in Middletown. But that was the only, actually I take that's in Peekskill. That was the only program in Peekskill that hasn't seen their lines. But the way we've kind of emphasized that is we view food as this opportunity to really welcome folks in and remind them at home, because they're going through so much right now. It's such a period of transition for folks individually. And so what we want to do is how do we give some sense of familiarity? And so one of the neat things that a lot of our food programs are doing is just around culturally relevant food, and constantly adjusting that to meet the needs of the folks who they're beginning to see on a daily basis. And so that's one thing that we're kind of doing. But then also just ensuring folks have access to resources, working within our existing structure of our Francis Perkins programs. I'm so grateful that we have folks with those skill sets on the ground that are able to speak to those needs right now. And so that's been a blessing, if you will. But those are kind of the ways we're addressing things within our existing structures right now.
That's just great, and adjusting the food to be culturally appropriate is
Yes.
just wonderful. You mentioned earlier the crisis of mental health.
Yes.
And of course it affects everyone, but we are particularly thinking about youth and kids, and as they were affected by the pandemic, and in general. What sorts of things, I know you have, EC has a bunch of youth programs.
Yes.
How are those programs addressing those questions of mental health for the youth?
Yes, absolutely. There's almost 2 things within that I want to foot stomp. So it's been a hard time for youth right now, a very hard time. As we knew, even at the beginning of the pandemic, where folks are taking so much time off of school, that was a challenge. And then it happened, the beginning of the pandemic was March of 2020, and so we rolled right into summer. And as we know, summer slide for so many youth, where the progress that they've made throughout the academic year, it dwindles because they are not in school, but a lot of times some of those summer programs help with that, but none of those programs were operating right then. And so it made it challenging, and excuse me, my paper fell. But it made it a difficult time where students fell behind and it was almost impossible to catch up. And so what's unfortunate is that in some places, as we know, a lot of times when folks are meeting, budgetary constraints, one of the first things to go is youth programs. And so what we've made a conscious decision to do was to keep that stable, if you will, because throughout the diocese, and this is an interesting thing, throughout the diocese, well, not even throughout the diocese, I would say just normal and nonprofit management, there's always greater need than what we have the ability to meet, if you will. And so we see that, and that's not new to the pandemic. That's normal, if you will. And so one of the things that we've done, like we have had to cut some of our BHN when we meet those constraints, in the sense of, and cut wasn't the right word. The better word is there's a higher percentage of need that we just can't meet, if that makes sense. Because we gave out more grants than we'd ever given out before. So that's good. It's just the need has gone up significantly. But with that being said, we wanted to be very conscious about how we're meeting the need in terms of youth opportunity grants. And so there's a much higher percentage on that in the sense of what was requested versus what we give. And so we wanted to keep that extremely high, just because we know that so many youth programs are being cut in other areas of the diocese. There are churches that have done away with some of their summer programming, which I'm thinking of one that was in Bronxville, which was a phenomenal and very innovative program. But last summer, they had to make the hard decision to close their doors. And so when children start looking for other places to be, we had to really increase our giving on that. And so despite the fact that there are fewer number of programs, we still kept funding at the same level to be able to really ensure that those programs can still operate. Yeah.
Right. It's
I know that was a roundabout way of saying it, but I wanted to make sure it was clear.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's such an important part of the work that you do. So looking ahead, we're in the middle of so much right now at present, and you've got so much on your plate right now. But what do you think the future role of Episcopal Charities is within the diocese, and how do you envision the trajectory of the organization in the years ahead?
Yes. No, and thank you for asking that. That's always a tough one for me. And so a little bit of just about my background. I must admit, I'm completing a PhD dissertation right now, and where I'm writing extensively about this idea for best practices for churches to engage in a risk-taking mission. And so I'm always big on this idea of how do we engage in this risk-taking mission, and how does that relate to us just being followers of Christ, if you will. And so I think there's some risk involved in that, but really to get ministry outside of the walls of the church, if you will. And so with that, just my approach to ministry as a whole is this idea of where we're all working to solve the same problems, but there are different on-ramps. And so even at Episcopal Charities, we try to create multiple on-ramps for folks, whether it's, hey, I can give financially, or I can give of my time. And so we have a volunteer network that we connect folks to different programs. Or it could be, I can be of service on the board of directors, or I can do site visits on the advisory committee. So I'm always focusing on these various on-ramps. And the reason I bring that up is because I mentioned it earlier in this sense that I am constantly eavesdropping at different parishes in the sense of what's going on throughout the diocese. And so although when I was eavesdropping at the beginning of my tenure, which was almost just 2 years ago, the focus was mental health and homelessness, I would say that now it's somewhat shifted, but not too much. But I think that is something that we could really kind kind of rally folks around. Just my background in leading programs, I'm always big on this idea of like having a big, hairy, audacious goal, if you will, that everyone's working on. But with that being said, what I'm hearing throughout the diocese is this idea of, and I wrote some of them down, improve housing stability and reduce homelessness throughout the Diocese of New York. The other was reduce poverty and food insecurity, which EC is already working in those avenues. But then also, I would say lastly, is cultivating this culture of volunteerism or community engagement in the sense of how do we re-engage volunteers to really work in their neighborhoods or their communities and make a difference, and doing that through the church. But with that being said, when we talk about a bigger picture, I see EC being one of those on-ramps. I think that there's a lot of different programs throughout the diocese that could connect with that, but I see EC being one of those potential on-ramps. But yeah.
That's fantastic. For folks who are here in the room and for folks watching online who are totally inspired by what you're saying and the work that you're doing, how might they get involved? What are some of the ways that they can join with your work?
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing that I always say is definitely reach out to us and let's just begin the conversation, because we never know where some of those conversations could go. And the reason I say that, when we talk about on-ramps, there are so many different ways to serve. For instance, we're in the middle of recruiting board members right now, and so that's a potential way to serve. One of the unique things about our distribution model is that when we're going through our grant adjudication process, which is determining where money goes, basically, we use what we call an advisory committee. And what's unique about this advisory committee is when you look at the regions throughout the diocese, we recruit a certain number of folks from each region, and they're in those grant adjudication meetings making decisions about the programs that are in the neighborhoods where they live. And so it's not so much, Manhattan competing against the Bronx or Westchester competing against Staten Island. Our advisory committee members are part of those communities that they're serving, and we always make sure that they're meeting with each other, if you will. And so typically what that looks like is we break each of the regions down, and for the first week they'll meet together, and then the following week we'll have one night where everyone meets. But all of that to say, we need folks on our advisory committee right now. We're in the middle of bringing on an additional, we're recruiting more MSW interns right now, and so any connections there or connections to schools of social work, right now we're working with Fordham, NYU, Adelphi, and Hunter. And so, but any connections you might have to additional schools of social work, we're definitely open to that, because there's such a great need throughout the diocese. And then the most obvious way to connect, which is what we've done for the first 25 years, is just giving financially as well. And so you can give on our website. I believe I saw a handout or a bulletin of ways that you can give. But any way that you want to be involved, we're definitely open to it. And even if there's something that we're not thinking of, because we want to be responsive to the needs of our communities. And so definitely reach out, give us a call. But I'm always open to a conversation. But yeah, and our staff is as well, I must say.
Well, thank you, Kevin. We're going to have some time for questions from people in the room and from people joining us online. If you're in the room, Conrad Tinney has question cards, and he can pass those out and bring them to me if you have questions. And if you are joining us online, you can email your questions to me at mward@stbarts.org. You can post them in the chat or in the comments section on Facebook or YouTube, and they will get to me. And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I did just want to highlight what Kevin said about giving to Episcopal Charities. This is Episcopal Charities Sunday here at St. Bart's, and if you've joined us for worship at 9, or if you're joining us for worship at 11, you will see one of these envelopes in your service leaflet. This is an opportunity to put a check in the plate. You can also give online and check out the bulletin for other ways to give. You can go online to episcopalcharities-newyork.org to give online. Hope you will do that and give generously, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a mutual relationship. We give to Episcopal Charities gives back to us, and it is a wonderful reciprocal relationship that we have. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I wondered if we could just dig a little deeper on the Frances Perkins program. Of course, Frances Perkins is someone who I think has been, her gifts and her gifts to the Episcopal Church and to the country have been somewhat overlooked. And I'm really interested also, just as the Associate Rector for Pastoral Care here, of the ways in which churches become centers for providing reasons to those who in need. And we're very good at feeding people. We're very good at caring for people pastorally. But there are those, as I mentioned earlier, that gap in the process where we need to be able to connect people with resources that are existing out there, and we don't always know what they are. So tell us a little more about how that works and how that's going.
Yes, no, and thank you for asking that. So for us, the biggest challenge initially was recruiting a supervisor. So we really had to create a position for a supervisor, because the biggest hurdle that most folks have, which is what we had at Episcopal Charities, is in order to receive the MSW students, we need someone on staff with an MSW to serve as their supervisor. And so with that, I would say that was a God moment, in the sense that there was a very seasoned professional from Chicago moving to New York, who is a faithful Episcopalian, and when she heard that we were looking for someone to fill that role, it was really just God kind of moving, connecting us together. And so we were very blessed in that sense to be able to get the program off the ground. An interesting thing that we learned with this is that connecting folks to resources, although, for instance, the MSW students, they have a good, toolbox, in the sense of what are some of the programs and services around, or resources around the city especially, that we can connect folks to. So that wasn't hard. The part that was hard, that we, I won't speak for my entire team, I will say I underestimated, was just the amount of time that would take to establish those relationships. Because one of the things that we noticed with our interns is that they would see the same folks come through line for several weeks before they were willing to open up to them. And so it's really this idea of like a persistence, in the sense of not so much pushy, but being open and willing to have a conversation. And after seeing that same familiar face, kind of that consistency, because we have it in our own lives, we want that consistency, but it was once folks started seeing, hey, this person's always here, this person's always greeting me with a smile, it's always the same person. And so after establishing those relationships, that's when we started really seeing the impact of that program, if you will. But it did take our students some time to develop that.
I think it makes sense that trust needs to develop.
Exactly.
Right? And that sense of consistency.
Yes.
Along those lines, we have a question from someone in the room who mentions, you spoke of Guatemalans and spaghetti.
Yes.
How do you engage migrants to determine how best to respond to their culinary needs? And that's, again, I imagine, part of the relationship building.
Absolutely, especially around building trust. One of the things, so I talk about my background, and so I'll be transparent and humble in this. But my background is working with space systems, and so I love spreadsheets and data. And what I had to learn, especially, and our interns were great at teaching me this, is we can create the most amazing form to be able to track folks in the sense of like, hey, what are some preferences? How do we meet needs? And we saw time and time again, it really went back to those relationships, if you will, because right now, we know the time that we live in, folks can be skeptical, if you will, and probably should be. And so it was this question of, why are you collecting this data? Where is this data going? And so we had to take a few steps back, if you will, and really kind of let it grow organically. But with that being said, we're training some of our program staff in the sense of what types of questions to ask, even if, it's not with a clipboard or with an iPad. And so we had to take some steps back on that. But with that being said, once those relationships are established, you'll be amazed at, and I know you know this, but yeah, just the way that folks open up to you. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the same kind of level of trust that I can share
Exactly.
this with you, and you're not going to.
Exactly.
Turn on me.
Use it against me.
Yeah.
Send it to someone else.
Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. Here's a question. What are the clearest differences between urban and rural communities in need, or are there differences?
Yeah. So this was interesting to me, was seeing how much similarities there were across the spectrum. When I said I was eavesdropping and I heard homelessness and mental health, that wasn't just in Manhattan, that was across the entire diocese. So I was really blown away that there weren't that there were a lot of the similar problems, if you will. Now, what I will say, and this is going back to the conversation I had with the folks up in Poughkeepsie, is that I'm seeing, especially with the rise of remote work, folks moving out of the city, the way the housing crisis impacts those individuals are a little bit different, because even in Poughkeepsie, we've heard so many stories of where there were boarded up homes where folks who were housing insecure were able to kind of go beyond those boarded up homes and find shelter on nights where it may have been raining, nights where it was snowing, inclement weather, all those things. But with so many folks migrating, or I should say moving north, because they only have to come into the city once, and so they give up their one-bedroom apartment in the city, and now they're living in Poughkeepsie, or Peekskill is seeing the same thing. But what it's doing is kind of pushing a few folks out. And so it's kind of this trickle effect. And so even when we start talking about property taxes, some folks are no longer able to afford rent or property taxes in places even in the far northern regions of the diocese, which is interesting, just how that affects, kind of trickles, for lack of better words.
Yeah.
But all of that to say, it's the same problem, but just where folks are being hit by that problem is a little bit different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone wants to know, have you developed a government liaison to lobby for migrant work papers?
So, no, I smile when you say that. And here's the reason why, is that we were just going through some quarterly reviews, and one of our staff members, I won't say who, I won't put them under the bus, if you will, but they're always sending me these different resources on advocacy, if you will. And so just through conversations, part of the goals for Q3 and Q4 with that particular individual is, how do we really kind of strengthen our advocacy muscles, if you will, as an organization. It's not something that we've done traditionally over the last 25 years, but it's something that we want to get into. And so that's on that individual's radar. But and I know that they're going to knock it out of the park, but that's definitely something that we as an organization, and not just that only that individual, but all of us want to begin leaning into, if you will. But yeah.
It's not advocacy. It hasn't been something traditionally that
at Episcopal Charities,
EC has done, but it would be interesting to explore that.
Absolutely, and that's
Yeah.
really a part of my background. During the time that I was at Riverside running social justice ministries, I may have mentioned it, but my official title there was Minister of Justice, Advocacy, and Change. And so a lot of advocacy work is in my background. I wish I had more time to do it personally, but I think we've got staff in place where we can do some amazing things together. So
That's
yes.
amazing. That's yet more work for the future.
Yes, absolutely.
Kevin, thank you so much. A reminder that if you'd like to get involved with Episcopal Charities, you can feel free to reach out to Kevin today or just email the organization. There are lots of ways to get involved. And also a reminder that to give generously. What goes around comes around. You'll find an envelope in your leaflet, or you can give online at episcopalcharities-newyork.org. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us. It has been a delight and just wonderful to learn more about the great work that Episcopal Charities is doing. Please join us for worship at the 11 o'clock service immediately following this forum. And next week, just to let you know, our rector will be talking to John Castle, who is coming to talk to us about the Siraj Library Project, which introduces libraries to Palestinian children. So hope you will join us for that next week. And Kevin, thank you so much again. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you so much for having me. And thank you all. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes.